It's me, Fire Dude. I'm making a beanie. I think I'm gonna start with yellow. And I'm gonna watch videos.
I spent 25 years in law enforcement.
I had the honor of serving as the state's first Homeland Security
around
Director, and I'm very proud to support Katie Hobbs.
When local departments down south needed help, Hobbs sent the National Guard.
Governor Hobbs took decisive action.
Katie Hobbs, bucking her own party, announcing a massive investment of money and manpower.
Tougher sentences for child predators and sex traffickers. Governor Hobbs has our back.
For a safer, secure Arizona, join me in voting for Governor Katie Hobbs.
We love
I like
John
Katie
Oliver.
Hobbs.
John Oliver doesn't give a hoot about legal advice. Of course, we only love him because we're not acting as his lawyer. His lawyers probably hate it because John loves legal stunts, and we love that for him. And as we recently covered in July, John Oliver put a knockout beaver on a t-shirt and publicly dared one of the largest convenience store chains in America to sue him over it. And you might recall that Buc-ee's sued a Mini Mart in Beaver Creek, Ohio instead, and now the internet is waiting to find out whether Buc-ee's will actually pick on someone his own size. But this is not the first time that John Oliver has hilariously pointed out legal absurdity, or the first time he's invited someone to sue him over trademark or copyright. You might remember John has been baiting Disney to sue him for copyright infringement for years. In an April 2023 segment, John discussed the upcoming expiration of the Steamboat Willie copyright and then introduced a Mickey Mouse-like character as the show's new mascot, daring Disney lawyers to take action.
I thought I wasn't public domain until next year.
That's actually true, buddy. We are pushing the limit a bit here.
The point is, we are staking our claim to Mickey Mouse right now.
And I know Disney's lawyers might take the trademark angle and argue that this Mickey is closely associated with their brand, although they should know that he's pretty closely associated with our brand now, too.
And in February 2024, when John later appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert to promote season 11 of Last Week Tonight, he brought a friend along.
I see you brought a +1.
Yeah.
Is this Mickey from Steamboat Willie?
It is. It's Steamboat Willie's Mickey Mouse, which is now available for public use. It's not Mickey Mouse. I can't stress that enough. It's luckily there's no resemblance, so there shouldn't be confusion.
And John openly taunted Disney, even presenting a promotional poster that featured Steamboat Mickey, and asked, what are they going to do, sue?
Yeah, so our poster this year features Steamboat Willie Mickey Mouse here, and so we're very lucky to have him. Do you have the poster?
I do have the poster. Yes.
We have this is our poster for this year. The tagline is, "What are they going to do? Sue?"
And Colbert openly wondered if this made him an accomplice.
That's my question.
Yes.
Is that I know you enjoy being sued.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Or else you wouldn't be trying to get someone else to sue you. I have been sued many times.
Yes.
Am I an accomplice by having him on?
And later, John brought Steamboat Mickey back onto the show for several related segments.
I would just say happy birthday to this. Oh, you're not special. Nothing about you is special. Instead of saying happy birthday to your kids when you brings out the pizza, say this. As a citizen of the United States of genocidal and terroristic empire, the world has a known. Your silence is completely
Now, smartly, Disney has yet to take John up on his offer to sue, but if they did, would he win? Now, we already covered the basics of copyright in our Buc-ee's video. The short answer is that copyright gives creators a temporary monopoly over original expression. The Constitution itself says that
Keeping temper.
lasts only for limited times, and when the term expires, the work enters the public domain. And Steamboat Willie finally did. After Congress repeatedly extended the copyright terms, the 1928 version of Mickey Mouse's debut entered the public domain on January 1st, 2024. And that creates an interesting wrinkle for John because he didn't wait. He introduced his Steamboat Willie character in 2023 when copyright was still alive. Of course, his lawyers could and would argue that the use was parody and therefore protected fair use under 17 U.S.C. Section 107 of the Copyright Act. As we've talked about many times on this channel, the statute specifically recognizes criticism and commentary as purposes that can support fair use. And John had a very compelling argument that he was using Mickey to criticize Disney's aggressive approach to intellectual property. But the timing would still give his lawyers something to worry about. If Disney had sued over the 2023 broadcast, the case would have turned on whether John's use was fair, not simply on the fact that Steamboat Willie was about to enter the public domain. Which brings us to Colbert. If John had actually infringed Disney's copyright, could Colbert have been liable for encouraging him and, publicizing the TV show? I kind of doubt it. Copyright law does recognize secondary liability for people who materially contribute to someone else's infringement. The Supreme Court established one version of that rule in MGM Studios versus Grokster, holding that someone who intentionally induces copyright infringement can be liable for the resulting infringement. And the court recently revisited contributory liability in Cox Communications versus Sony Music Entertainment, where it ruled that contributory liability requires more than simply providing a platform or service that happens to be used for infringement. So if Colbert had actually encouraged John to infringe a still protected copyright, Disney would at least have an argument for contributory liability, but Disney had another big problem. When Colbert aired his segment in February 2024, Steamboat Willie had already been in the public domain for a few weeks, so Colbert could therefore breathe a sigh of relief, at least as far as that particular 1928 version of Mickey was concerned. But copyright isn't the only legal issue here, though. And this is something that lots of commentators got wrong or didn't understand when they were talking about Mickey entering into the public domain. Also at play here is a healthy serving of delicious, rich, and always satisfying trademark law. And speaking of delicious, I had an incredible chicken chow mein for lunch, and I'm still thinking about it. It was crafted by Chef Hong Tai-mi, and I can't wait to order it again from Cook Unity, the sponsor of this part of the video. Cook Unity is a chef-to-you meal delivery program that connects you with hundreds of fresh, fully prepared meals from award-winning chefs. And with Cook Unity, you can choose from over 400 meals nationwide each week, including over 45 global cuisines and diets. All meals are handcrafted in small batches in kitchens local to you. There are over 130 chefs on the platform, including Food Network stars, James Beard Award winners, and Michelin-starred masters. Meals are delivered fully cooked. All I have to do is heat them up, and in 2 minutes or less, you're ready to eat. Now, I love to cook, but my days are crazy busy, so it's great that I get to reclaim that time, and I don't have to spend at least half an hour preparing a subpar meal and then a bunch of time cooking up. And that's what I love most about Cook Unity. It's like having hundreds of the best gourmet restaurants in the comfort of your own home or office, all ready to go instantly. So for my next weekly order, I'm going to check out more meals crafted by Chef Hong Tai-mi, like her creamy lobster green curry, and pick up my usual favorites like the flank steak burrito from Chef Tony Perez. And you should seriously try Cook Unity. It's an incredible quality of life upgrade, and they're offering Legal Eagles 50% off your first order when you use the code LegalEagle50. So click or scan now to get chef-made meals delivered fresh to your door, or I'll see you in court. And before you celebrate the expiration of the Steamboat Willie copyright by starting an internet business producing Mickey Mouse merch, it's important to understand the limitations of the public domain. Only the original 1928 version of Steamboat Willie is in the public domain. So remember, guys, you can use the mouse, but not his gloves, keyballs, or his current personality. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every subsequent version of Mickey Mouse is free of copyright protection. It also doesn't mean that Mickey Mouse and Disney are free of trademark protection. There's an important limit on how far trademark law can go, though. In a case called Death Star Corp versus 20th Century Fox Film Corp, the Supreme Court rejected an attempt to use trademark law as a substitute for copyright protection over a work whose copyright had expired. Trademark law protects consumers from confusion about the source of the goods, but it doesn't give copyright owners a perpetual monopoly over works simply because their copyright has expired. But that also doesn't mean that a public domain character can never function as a trademark. In a case called Frederick Warren versus Book Sales, a federal court held that a public domain Peter Rabbit illustration could still function as a trademark. So there is a genuine tension here. Disney can argue that consumers associate certain versions or images of Mickey with Disney, while a seller can argue that trademark law can't be used to take a public domain character back out of the public domain. Where that line falls depends heavily on how the character is being used and whether consumers are likely to be confused about the source or sponsorship of the goods. And in our previous video, we discussed how trademark law creates several distinct causes of action, including trademark confusion. Basically, you can't use a trademark in a way that is likely to confuse consumers about the source, sponsorship, or affiliation of your product. And John's assertion that his Steamboat Mickey character is unlikely to be confused with Disney's newer, still copyright-protected versions of Mickey Mouse is significant. The expiration of the copyright in the original Steamboat Willie version does not eliminate Disney's trademark rights. Disney can still have a claim if John used the character in a way likely to cause consumers to believe his product was affiliated with, sponsored by, or approved by Disney. And Disney can also argue trademark dilution. That's a different theory. It protects famous trademarks from uses that are likely to blur their distinctiveness or tarnish their reputation, even when consumers aren't necessarily confused about who made the product. But John could defend himself by arguing that his use of Steamboat Willie was parody, once again. And parody can matter in trademark cases, but it isn't an automatic get out of trademark jail free card. Because, as we talked about in 2023, this report addressed exactly that problem in Jack Daniel's properties versus VIP products, involving a honest way that parodying the Jack Daniel's whiskey bottle and use similar branding. The court held that when the defendant uses another company's trademark as a source identifier for its own products, the usual trademark rules still apply. The fact that the product is a joke does not automatically end the analysis. Ultimately, it would be up to a judge or jury to decide whether or not a particular use of Steamboat Mickey crossed the line as a trademark infringement or violation. And as we noted in our Bucky's video, juries can be unreliable. And like Bucky's, Disney seems unwilling to launch a legal battle against John HBO and parent company Warner Brothers Discovery. That doesn't mean that Disney is letting Steamboat Willie quietly slip into the public domain without a fight, though. Instead, Disney ended up in a legal dispute with personal injury law firm Morgan, which intended to run an ad featuring Steamboat Willie. The law firm took the notable step of including a disclaimer at the beginning of the ad, probably to eliminate those pesky trademark confusion claims.
This warning video was not approved, authorized, or endorsed by Disney.
And when Disney indicated it still held trademark rights over Steamboat Willie and refused to give permission to run the advertisement, Morgan took Disney to court, seeking an order to clarify whether the company could still enforce its trademark. But the law firm later dropped the lawsuit before the court could rule. Though it did run the ad, and so far Disney has not sued. But who knows, maybe if John keeps needling Disney, he can create some clarity in U.S. copyright and trademark law. But copyright and trademark are not the only areas where John regularly pushes boundaries. John also loves to test the boundaries of defamation law. His most famous legal skirmish was referenced in the Bucky segment. In 2017, Last Week Tonight aired an episode about the coal industry that took aim at Bob Murray, the CEO of Murray Energy. John accused Murray of fighting mine safety regulations, misrepresenting the cause of the critical Canadian mine disaster, and being less than sincere about his concern for
It's easy
He also compared Murray to
to solve this trademark thing.
I have to proceed.
If you use my trademark on your product, you owe me the profits from your product.
John also included two
It's my trademark.
The first involved a bonus
So
program.
don't use my trademark if you don't want to give me your profits.
John noted that this bonus
There,
program
problem
had been
solved.
rejected by the workers because of safety concerns. The company launched it anyway and told the workers that if they didn't like it, they could just write void on their checks. But the results probably weren't what Bob expected.
Around 62 employees did just that, with 2 going even further. One returning a check for $11.58 by writing "Kiss my ass, Bob" on it, and another taking a check for $3.22 and writing "Eat shit, Bob."
And John's second anecdote involved a company rumor.
Union miners claim that Murray used to tell them that he was sitting on his back porch contemplating his future when he was approached by a squirrel, who hopped up next to him, looked him in the eye and said, "Bob Murray, you should be operating your very own mines."
And these two anecdotes form the basis for one of John's most famous gags.
Hey there, Mr. Nutterbutter, I understand that you have a message for Bob Murray.
I do.
Okay.
Hey, Bob. Just wanted to say, if you're planning on suing, I do not have $1 billion. But I do have a check for 3 acorns and 18 cents.
Oh, that's very nice of you, Mr. Nutterbutter.
It is?
Yeah.
It's made out to... Eat shit, Bob. Go Bob, kiss your ass.
Murray's lawyers threatened to sue before the episode even aired, but John Oliver responded by doing what John Oliver does, airing the segment anyway, with a personal message to Murray.
I didn't really plan for so much of this piece to be about you, but you kind of forced my hand on that one. And I know that you are probably going to sue me, but you know what? I stand by everything I said.
Murray, unlike Disney though, followed through.
So as we have been explicitly told to cease and desist, let us do neither of those things, and let's talk about Bob Murray.
He sued. Murray argued that John's statements were false and that John knew or recklessly disregarded them. Murray said that he and his employees were being harassed because of John Oliver, and he dubbed this negative publicity and backlash as the John Oliver effect. He claimed that Murray Energy's website was overrun with messages of "Eat shit, Bob," and Murray asked the court for a preliminary injunction preventing HBO from rebroadcasting the episode. That was a problem for Murray. A court order preventing future publication is what we call a prior restraint, which the First Amendment treats presumptively as unconstitutional. And Judge Jeffrey Kramer rejected Murray's request and dismissed the case, saying he adopted with, quote, little exception HBO's arguments. The ACLU, which filed an amicus brief, was particularly enthusiastic about Murray's theory, and its table of contents, including headings like Anyone can legally say "eat shit, Bob," and plaintiff's motion for a temporary restraining order is ridiculous. Murray appealed, though, and kept the lawsuit alive for years. Eventually,
at YoPlay, we seek out only the finest peaches, sun-ripened to perfection. Your taste buds will thank us. YoPlay, America's favorite peach yogurt.
They were out for glory and amazing jeans, so they hit the road for the one place where denim looks like $1 million but costs around 22. The most wanted denim.
So name it, baby.
Save the money. Check lift.
show up when inspiration turns into action. Reach high-intent holiday shoppers on Google. Eventually, after Murray Energy filed for bankruptcy, the case was dropped. And to everyone's delight, in 2020, Murray died. And his cause of death, and I'm not making this up, was black lung. And of course, John Oliver did a very elaborate victory dance.
Shit!
John has since disclosed that the lawsuit cost HBO more than $200,000 in legal fees and tripled the show's libel insurance rates. So to recap, HBO spent $200,000 to establish that you are legally permitted to call a man a geriatric Dr. Evil. I call that money well spent. And John took this as an opportunity to educate the public about SLAPP lawsuits, that is, strategic lawsuits against public participation. And as John pointed out, Murray's goal was never to win the case. It was to shut down legitimate criticism of Murray and his company.
What was the point of him putting us through all of this in the first place? Well, I would argue it's because winning the case was never really his goal.
Now, a wealthy company with hosts of attorneys on staff or a retainer can impose huge legal costs on a newspaper, journalist, or media outlet, as Murray had before with Ohio's small local newspaper, the Chagrin Valley Times. But this doesn't just silence that media outlet, it effectively silences all media outlets because no one wants to pay $200,000 in legal fees. That would effectively bankrupt most individuals in small media outlets. And SLAPP suits often come in the form of defamation lawsuits, but sometimes can involve claims of trademark infringement, which probably sounds familiar, or deceptive trade practices. Donald Trump, for example, has made this an art, which is why we think that anti-SLAPP laws are so important. These are laws designed to prevent this kind of harassment or litigation, or at least make them much shorter and less expensive. Now, these vary from state to state, but strong anti-SLAPP laws usually allow defendants to seek dismissal early in the lawsuit, before legal fees really pile up. And even better, they often allow successful defendants to recover their legal fees from the plaintiffs, which can be a pretty strong deterrent against frivolous, chilling lawsuits. But as of the recording of this video, there is no federal anti-SLAPP statute. So the obvious workaround is to file in a state that has no anti-SLAPP law, or to file in most federal courts. And that's why Murray filed in West Virginia. Though in 2025, John got sued again for defamation, Dr. Brian Morley, but this time it was in a state with an anti-SLAPP law. Dr. Morley was briefly discussed in a 2024 segment about how Medicaid privatization was resulting in cuts to patient care programs, and during the segment, John told the story of Louis Vicenna, an Iowa man with cerebral palsy, and the nursing services had been reduced. Those services included assistance with bathing and changing diapers.
Louis Vicenna's cerebral palsy. I was living with his market image.
It's not cerebral. It's cerebral.
What's an MCO?
Hey, it's not cerebral palsy, as in terrible. It's cerebral, as in the cerebellum. The cerebellum.
He had for years.
And he introduced it with the following explanation.
Palsy.
That's obviously badly. And it doesn't get any better when you hear a doctor at AmeriHealth, the MCO that took over in Iowa, explaining in a hearing about a similar patient just what the corporate thinking was about the necessity of keeping people clean.
Then John played actual audio featuring Dr. Morley.
People have bowel movements every day where they don't completely clean themselves, and we don't
fuss over too much people or not with a whole meeting.
John was understandably disgusted.
I'll be honest,
What?
when I first heard that, I thought,
You feel dirty.
no way. A doctor, a licensed physician, will testify in a hearing that he thinks it's okay if people have shit on them for days. So we got the full hearing. I'm not going to play it for you. I'm just going to tell you, he said it. He meant it. And it made me want to punch a hole in them.
But Dr. Morley quickly sued for defamation in the Southern District of
It's not defamation if it's true.
Morley could possibly accuse John of defamation since truth is generally a defense to defamation claims, and John played the actual audio of Dr. Morley's testimony. Dr. Morley, though, claimed was accurate. John had defamed them, leaving out crucial context about misrepresenting
What context could possibly make that better?
By summarizing Dr. Morley's statement as, quote, he thinks it's okay if people have shit on them for days. Essentially, Dr. issue was in editing that the excerpt of the quote without context and the insertion of other context around it, including the discussion of an unrelated patient, the high denial care rates, and the potential legality of those denials. John countered that his assertions were either accurate facts or protected opinions, and that he was protected by New York's fair report privilege. The fair report privilege protects
What
journalists from
context could possibly have made that better?
In an official proceeding. Dr. Morley's statements had been pulled from an official hearing, and John had also relied on an Iowa State auditor's report when discussing improper Medicaid
Extra
denials.
context
And
is
under
just
fair report privilege, a journalist doesn't have to quote an official proceeding word for word when reporting it.
fluff.
They can summarize and characterize it, provided the account is substantially accurate. And Judge Ronnie Abrams found that all of John's statements were either not actually about Dr. Morley himself, were opinions, or were accurate statements protected by the fair report privilege. And the court specifically addressed
What?
John's most inflammatory claim, saying Oliver's statement that Morley testified it was okay if people have shit on them for days is thus both a fair report of Morley's testimony and substantially true. Judge
Yep.
Abrams granted Oliver's motion to dismiss in June of 2026. But there's an important wrinkle here. Because Morley sued in federal court, specifically in courts covered by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, Oliver did not get to use the special anti-SLAPP motion to dismiss. Most federal courts have held that anti-SLAPP laws are procedural, and procedure that conflicts with the federal rules of civil procedure do not apply in federal court. What Oliver did get was the substantive protection New York added to its anti-SLAPP law in 2020. Under New York Civil Rights Law, Section 76A, the plaintiff in an action involving public petition and participation must satisfy the actual malice standard. And New York's anti-SLAPP law has another provision designed to make this whole. Section 70 allows the defendant to recover attorneys, but there's a catch. In federal court, Oliver's lawyers needed to assert that fee claim as a counterclaim or bring a separate action, rather than simply asking Judge Abrams to award the fees after dismissing Morley's lawsuit. They didn't do that, so Oliver won the case, but lost out on the attorney's fees the anti-SLAPP statute was designed to provide. And maybe this is why HBO opted not to fund another high-budget big release. But given John's many legal dares,
The whole point of the anti-SLAPP law or saying what they're legally allowed to say.
But then you're only making another one of your activities based on communication. You're typing instead of speaking.
You
But you can change
decide
that to
you
use productivity by using WhisperFlow, the sponsor of this portion of the video. Oh, sorry. Just got a message I need to respond to. I don't know, how about just me using WhisperFlow like I always. Let's do a really meta thing. With me using the product is the sponsorship itself. I love WhisperFlow and I've been using it for a while. You speak naturally and WhisperFlow turns that into clean form of text that's ready to send. And you don't have to set it up for every app you use. It just works with it. So Slack, Gmail, Teams, Cursor, Notion, Notes, iMessage, it works everywhere. But WhisperFlow is a smart voice-to-text tool and not just built-in voice dictation. Built-in voice dictation like Siri captures all your mistakes and produces messy, often incomprehensible outputs. People just assume the dictation WhisperFlow with your mistakes in real time, adapts as you change your mind, and formats your text.
Why you are doing nothing that I tell you to do?
The text is clean, clear, formatted, and ready to go. This can save hours every day just by using WhisperFlow. So click our scan and start using WhisperFlow for free. And use code
Come on!
do
what I tell you to do. Do what I tell you to do. Do what I tell you to do.
So make the switch from typing to dictation, or I'll see you in court. Now, one of my
Technology hates me today.
2015, John started his own tax.
I don't understand it.
In the August 16th, 2015,
just do it. Why won't you just do it? Why won't you just do it? Why won't you just do it? Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it. Do it. Why are you still not doing it?
John suddenly
First, that's really far.
Go!
That is when I realised.
Just do what I tell you to do.
Was I should set up my own church
Finally.
to test the legal and financial limits of what religious entities.
Edit post. It shouldn't take you a half an hour to let me edit a post.
He, Mega Reverend, along with his fictitious wife, told viewers to sow a seed by sending him money.
A seed! Always! Yes. Preferably in the form of cash on
It can be $5, it can be $10, it can be $77. You need to sell your biggest seed.
And they responded generously.
And like the autumn story of Noah, you took one look at what we were right.
Next. I clicked on next. But you to understand, next means next. Save.
Mega Reverend John generously donated all proceeds to Doctors Without Borders. Sadly, the church was forced to shut down just a month later. John explained that this was definitely not because they were legally obligated to close the church.
However, I am sorry to report to you that tonight we are closing down the church. Not because we have to. We have still not broken any laws by promising you untold riches in return for sending us money.
The reason that Our Lady of the Perpetual Exemption was forced to close is that some viewers took John's instruction to send us your seed a little too literally. But John was probably right about not being legally obligated to close the church because the IRS guidelines are every bit as vague as John reported. 26 U.S.C. Section 501c3 provides federal tax exemption for operated for purposes, including religious purposes.
What?
There's an important distinction between an ordinary religious nonprofit and something legally treated as a church. The qualifying church is automatically considered tax exempt. The IRS specifies that it doesn't have to file an application with the IRS and obtain a determination letter first. And qualifying donations can still be deductible by donors even if the church never sought formal IRS recognition. Churches also generally don't have to file the annual Form 990 information return required of many exempt organizations. And as John noted, federal tax law simple definition of what a church is.
Now, while the IRS does not have a definition of a church, they do have a 14-point test as a guideline for churches. But not only do you not have to meet all 14 points, we'd already met some of them by accident.
The IRS has considered a collection of characteristics, things like a recognized creed and form of worship, an established congregation, regular religious services, ordained ministers, places of worship, ecclesiastical government, and so forth. But the vagueness of the IRS guidelines, though, is a feature, not a bug. There is an obvious constitutional problem with government officials deciding whether someone's religious beliefs are sufficiently legitimate. The IRS can't simply say your religion sounds ridiculous, therefore it's not a religion. That would create serious First Amendment establishment and free exercise concerns. And that's why Scientology is still considered a tax-exempt religious organization. The Church of Scientology spent literal decades fighting over tax exemptions with the IRS. And the IRS claimed that the Church of Scientology wasn't a church at all. It was a for-profit entity that enriched its leaders. But the Church of Scientology did not take this well. It launched a war against the IRS, filing suits against the agency, feeding negative stories about the agency to news organizations, and supporting IRS whistleblowers. At one point, 11 high-ranking Church of Scientology officials, including L. Ron Hubbard's wife, were charged with an alleged widespread conspiracy to plant spies in government agencies, steal official documents, and bug government meetings. The church even had a code name for its decades-long campaign against the U.S. government, Operation Snow White, because everything goes back to Disney, apparently. And one of the primary legal fights was over the fees the church charged for so-called audits. The Scientologists claimed that these were a religious donation. The IRS disagreed, claiming that this wasn't a religious donation. It was a payment for a service and was thus taxable. But the Church of Scientology took this case all the way to the Supreme Court in Hernandez versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue in 1989. And the court sided with the IRS, finding that there was a distinction between a purchase of services from a religious organization and a donation to that one. Then something unexpected happened. In 1993, the IRS reached a super confidential settlement with the Church of Scientology. For several years, the settlement was the subject of intense secrecy and scrutiny. Then finally, in 1997, the terms were leaked. In the final agreement between the Church of Scientology and the IRS, the Scientologists promised to pay back $12.5 million for decades of potential tax evasion and to call off its war on the United States tax collectors. And the IRS promised to accept the Church of Scientology as a tax-exempt entity. Though a lot of people thought this sudden reversal was kind of weird, especially since news outlets like the New York Times bypassed its own committee experts and usual procedures to hand Scientology a total victory. This created a real legal quandary for the IRS, though. If the Church of Scientology could maintain its tax-exempt status while charging for its audits, what was the line between a taxable fee for a service and a tax-exempt donation? Well, in 2002, two parents who were paying tuition to their children's religious school decided to test the boundaries of this rule. In Sklar versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the scholars argue that the IRS was allowing members of the Church of Scientology to deduct payments for religious auditing and training. And if the IRS could treat those payments as charitable contributions, they argued denying Orthodox Jewish parents a comparable deduction amounted to unequal and potentially unconstitutional treatment. The Ninth Circuit, though, rejected the scholars' attempt to deduct their children's tuition. Under 26 U.S.C. Section 170 and Supreme Court precedent, a charitable contribution generally requires a payment without receiving something of value in return. And the scholars were paying tuition and receiving something in return, their children's education. The fact that the education was transformed the tuition payment into a charitable contribution. But that case exposed yet another awkward problem for the IRS. The court noted that the agency had apparently allowed Scientologists to deduct payments for auditing and training under a closing agreement. And the judge wrote that, quote, an IRS closing agreement cannot overrule Congress and the Supreme Court. And the court's answer was not to extend the questionable treatment to other religious groups. If the Scientology arrangement was inconsistent with the tax code or the Constitution, the answer was to stop treating Scientology differently. That did not happen, though, which is probably why the IRS didn't do anything about Our Lady of the Perpetual Exemption, and why it has been very reluctant to investigate churches generally.
We actually asked the IRS how many churches they've audited in recent years, and they did 1 in 2014 and just 2 in 2030.
Now, it's tempting to...
With Olay's Costco collection, you get an amazing, simple, and efficient multitasking routine for morning and night. A simple application of Olay Regenerase 10, you get 10 active ingredients to tackle 10 skin concerns. Olay Every Night Retinol is safe to use every night without irritating my skin. Ready to tackle the next very busy day.
Nature Made. Take charge of your gut health for a good gut day every day.
Save time creating content and generate a high-quality clone of your voice with 11 Labs. Change the way you record podcasts, voiceovers, and branded content with the #1 AI-powered voice-generating technology. Stop searching for the perfect voice and stop wasting time re-recording take after take. Try 11 Labs for free and start elevating your content today.
Now, it's tempting to look at the IRS's history with churches and conclude that the agency simply didn't want to investigate them, but the reality is more complicated. Congress has actually built a substantial procedural barrier into the tax code. Under Section 7611, the IRS generally cannot even begin a church tax inquiry unless, quote, appropriate high-level Treasury officials reasonably believe, based on facts recorded in writing beforehand, that the organization may not qualify for tax-exempt status or may be engaged in taxable activities. And in United States versus Living World Christian Center, a federal court held that the IRS official the agency had designated to make that determination wasn't sufficiently high-ranking. The decision effectively complicated the IRS's ability to conduct church examinations for years, while the agency struggled to finalize regulations addressing who could authorize them. So John once again proved his point via clever satire and legal dare. And so far, most of his potential legal rivals have chosen to avoid actual litigation, except for Bob Murray, and it might have killed him. But if there ever is another lawsuit, we'll be here to cover it. For now, though, props to John for calling out the ridiculousness of the U.S. legal system wherever he finds it. Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. They'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer, or how do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing. They're hiring for an attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, putting clients first, instead of cheating billable hours. A firm where you don't need to do anything for a lawyer, won't get paid if you do it for justice. So if few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it.
Yeah.
You said that you had put a post in Marco Polo
Yeah.
about ants in your bed.
Yeah.
She replied. She replied to you about it.
Yeah.
So you didn't tell me about ants in your bed.
There's nothing I can do about it.
Nothing?
No, what am I gonna do? I can't clean my room. I can't replace my mattress.
Go right down.
Okay.
Because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. But when you work on my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person, real stakes. If we can't represent you, or you're in state, or you don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, data breach, sexual harassment, and social security workers, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could. But what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the criminal attorneys we partnered with, we get the same principles of honesty and education we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. Making sure that life is complicated, you don't have to figure it out. When you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the legal team. Organic chicken, everyday low prices. It's an only thing.
Yo, it's me, Ali G. I've been gone for 20 years. Shit. In that time, the world went to crap. There was COVID, wars, and Ed Sheeran.
Ed Sheeran is awesome. What are you talking about?
It was a brand new thing. It's called a documentary. For the first time ever, this is a film with real people, no actors. It's fun. Shut the fuck up. I'm just out here. Oh, yeah, man, the cowards follow me everywhere. 9 was a flipping. You think she's pregnant? It's just nowadays. Probably when you go big hope, you don't think she's pregnant. It's positive. Yo, she got fat. That's the best.
Well, that's what's okay, so yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone. You call romance. What is that? Alright, no. Good advice on starting a family. If you want absolutely. Sick me. Make people get up. Come here, make me like a pillar.
He's a completely crazy.
Show me new movie. Ali G, who is that? Yeah,
What the? What? What?
What? Yeah. I ain't got a big one. But I think it's going to be. No, I was. It's got like a massive one.
Why is this ad still running? I don't. What? Ali G. Blah blah blah. What?
In which I gave a general overview of some of the hardware used in modern cash registers, and I thought nobody would care about that, but I was wrong. Apparently, you all want to know as much as possible about that topic, and I'm not.
Okay.
So, as of today, CRD now stands for cash register dues, accordingly. But seriously, that video, I thought it would do okay, and instead it was my successful release of 20. 5 by a wide margin, which of course means I'm now incredibly selfish to do next. But that's just
12. I was going to do 10.
Last episode was titled Basic Retail
Oh, wow.
Hardware, and it was an overview of the kind of machines that are used to accept money at stores these days, USB ports they use, and everyone seemed to like that. But it kind of surprised me that no one pointed out how odd it was to start out talking about how one of these things is actually used to bring something up, except, George really couldn't tell what I was doing. He wouldn't really show you the machines themselves either, just the plugs on the back. And that's because those were the only parts of the whole situation that I felt I could adequately explain in less runtime than Jake Cameron's hit film Titanic. So when I thread video to make a 4-hour follow-up episode describing how to operate a single cash register, I think a lot of viewers assumed I was called my bluff, so I started anyway. But then I ran into problems. See, the system I was going to address was called Wayne Nuclear. It's a product developed specifically for use by gas station convenience stores, and that's an extremely niche use case. So as you'd expect, there's 1,000 options specific to that niche, like underground gas tank monitoring and car wash management. That stuff's neat, but after a few days of writing, it started to feel a bit overwhelming as an introduction to retail systems, so I thought I should try purpose. So I then spent a week trying to set up another very well-known system called Toshiba Short Pause, which is used by all different types. But you discover that my TCX 350, really the 350E, supports short pause. And obviously my instinct was to rush to eBay and buy the right machine, except that by this point, this is a lot to take in, and that's coming from me. It's even worse when you don't actually know what these systems are meant to do. And probably an awful lot of people watching this have never worked.
Well, they're meant to register cash.
And that's when I realized that my real systems at all. See, Mental is one of those because they're buried under so much unrelated crap. Let me explain. When you go to a store, you probably think of the thing that the cashier punches numbers into before taking your money as the cash register. And that's true, but most of the machines you've encountered in your life were probably a type called a point of sale or POS system. Yes, it's true in both senses of the term. And while those do function as cash registers, they also do a lot of other things. Cash registering is just one of many things. And to be clear, I'm not really verbing that down as a bit. The original purpose of these things when they were invented 150 years ago was literally to register cash.
That's what I said.
The basic principles of that task haven't ever really changed. Modern day POS systems do the same things as they just do so much else in addition that we don't really recognize that original purpose anymore. But I think it would be very useful to decision making in modern systems. The trouble is you can't really reduce those systems back to the fundamentals because they're simply too ambitious. There are different software packages used for handling sales these days, and virtually all of them require extensive configuration before they'll do anything, using Byzantine interfaces that not only demand lengthy training to comprehend, also assume that you know the basics of retail cash management. If you don't, then none of it will make any sense. So I felt that we'd all benefit from looking at a machine that's essentially 50 years behind the times and thus predates all these developments. And that's how I ended up, once again, going back on my word. This is a true cash register. And I mentioned these as a type of device that exists in the last video, but I followed that up with something like, you probably could do a video about these things, but I'm not the guy to do it because I find them really boring. And at this point, I don't even know why I say stuff like that. I'm just cursing myself to do it anyway. So it's a Royal 9150. I picked it up on eBay a couple weeks ago for $20 plus shipping, and it's a very conventional specimen. I'd almost call it classic. It's from the mid to late 90s, I think, but its feature set is so sparse that it barely outperforms machines from the 60s. That makes it a great place to start you from, though. And conveniently, it's also roughly where I started from. I got my first job at age 17, ringing up customer e-waste store on a machine much like this one, And while it wasn't this one, the rudiments are so simple that when this arrived, I was able to use it without even reading the manual. Seriously, it's incredibly straightforward. Let me show you. Say you come into my store and you want to buy a Gatorade for $1.95, right? So I punch in $1.95, I hit beverages, you hand me $5, so I put that in, your change is $2.86. All right, out of 5, 1, 2, 75, 85 cents, 86. Have a nice day. Simple as. That, by the way, is
simple
what
as.
job training looks like at a place that would have bought one of these. Quick and sloppy, probably much like the store itself. That's, after all, places that just needed a register, no further adjectives. And all those places still exist. The market for these, even if you don't care about this stuff, it's hard to have missed in small business towards tablet-based sales solutions from companies like Clover and Square. They're cheap and easy to set up. They have integrated payment processing, and they offer so much room for growth that it's really no surprise they've come to dominate even the low end of the market. To wit, if you've been to a chain or non-chain coffee shop in the last 10 years, chances are you paid for your drink on an iPad.
What do you think?
Worked great.
Is that too small of a brim?
How many really tiny businesses
it's only about 6 deep.
From all their advanced features
versus half of 12 is 6.
Even the simplest mobile app has irritating complexities and failure modes. Sure, Square can run offline, but nothing stops your login from expiring at the same moment that your email account gets hijacked and your crappy cellular internet goes down, so you lose the ability to run transactions for 18 hours while through pathetic queues. And no person about to leave a cart at the same place as you.
No, never mind. It's too hard to undo what I just did.
The fact is that much of what Square and Clover offer, even in their simplest forms, involves employee logins, sales analytics, and inventory tracking. And
all right, what color am I
as the
going to do?
thinly veiled Starbucks stand-in put it in The Sopranos, that company puts every last coffee bean in the computer, but a lot of mom and pop stores don't have a need for anything like that.
It's over for the little guy.
If you're just a person who has some stuff traded for money, then this kind of machine presents the lowest possible friction. You can just turn it on and use it. No questions. Now, of course, none of those things are actually true at my first. We did have employees and inventory, so when we switched to a POS system about a year in, it was a tremendous relief that made things much. Indeed, POS systems really are very useful in the modern world because they keep track of sales trees, but the fact remains for quite a while on a case like this because all those things are optional, while this delivers what is mandatory. Punch in a price, pick a department, here's your change, have a nice day. That's the job and it always will be. So it's no surprise that I still have the muscle memory for running that machine, but I also have a memory of the first time that I looked at a feature on, okay, I see the what here, but not the why, and went off in search of an explanation. That feature was this little plastic window here. This is where my fascination with this whole topic began 20 years ago. So it's where we'll start too. I guess I should probably show you what it does then. Well, I'm sure everyone enjoyed the screech of the receipt printer as I rang up that sale a minute ago. And if so, you're in luck because I'm going to ask you to listen closely while I do it several more times.
Ow.
Okay, I swear this was more obvious when I tested it at home, but take my word for it. Sometimes partway through printing a line, you can hear a gap that doesn't show up on the receipt. So where's that gap? Well, if we take this cover off, now it should all make sense. Sort of. As you probably guessed from the sound, this is a dot matrix printer, and it looks pretty typical other than being on the small side. We have an ink ribbon here, and then this is the impact head, which moves back and forth every time it prints something. But look at what it's printing on. There are 2 separate rolls of paper in here. So acknowledge the buried lead. This is literally 2 printers, and they figured out how to build that using just 1.5 mechanisms. It's really very clever. The 2 paper rolls are driven separately from each other, so I can actually advance time. And while by default it does print the same thing on both steps. I can actually turn that on. Then switch modes over here. Now, it'll only print on the right receipt. The reason I can turn off that side, of course, is because that's the one that prints the cut. Most people don't want a receipt for a buck Gatorade, so why waste the paper? But the second one, I can't turn on. It's no matter what. And it doesn't come out the top of the machine. Instead, it's rolled up onto this takeout. And then once we put the cover on, it actually locks in place with a key. So I can now see this printout, but I can't touch it. I mean, well, on this specific model, I can because the window here actually flips open. So I can touch it. But that's a very odd feature that I've not seen on any other model. I'll speculate on why that's here much later. But the point is, even if you do open it, the receipt can't be removed, and you can't modify it. So all you can really do is see that it's there. And this is very much on purpose. The function of this window is to remind you that that receipt is there and that you can't touch it. And while I could explain why in a few words, rather explain the ancient history and fundamental purpose of the cash register and how this little plastic window is developed in the 1870s that's still relevant today. So, this one's going to be Retail 102, History and Theory. To get a few things straight up front, let's just start from the middle. The development of the cash register is a long and complex story, which I won't be covering in great detail today. But a very important point to make is that these things were invented in the 1800s. They underwent a slow and plodding development process for a few decades, and then they experienced a massive technological leap half of the 20th century. So the very basic machine that I have here is incredibly sophisticated by the standards of even the early 70s. And the reason for that is all in the name. This is classified as an ECR, or electronic cash register. So obviously what it replaced wasn't one of those things. 3 guesses as to which. To be clear, there certainly were electronic registers used as early as the mid-70s, at least in the wealthier stores. Places like theaters were fully computerized by 1975, and used which were based on enormous mainframe each checked in. Did all kinds of analytics and reporting, much like modern ones do. There were also small standalone devices, much like theater medium-sized stores had those. But if you went into, say, a register with more like, okay, please hold while I go again.
That's a monster. Dang, that's a beast.
We're keeping that There we go. Oh, jeez. So this is a typical early 70s offering from NCR, the biggest name in the market at the time. It's called a Class 24. It weighs 75 pounds, and it doesn't contain any electronics. In fact, it barely contains electrodes.
No electronics.
Can I rotate this? No, I'm going to rip the thing off. There we go. There we go. That's what you wanted to see.
Completely mechanical.
Oh, boy.
It's electromechanical.
It's electromechanical. All the calculations are done by contraptions made of cams and levers, which technically speaking still counts as a computer, but not the way we use the word nowadays. Though I admit, it does rust. This is a nearly solid hunk of steel plates and springs whose only concession to modernity, its only concession to maternity is that it's all driven by a motor, at least whenever possible. Normally, when you get this button, the motor runs the mechanism, makes this terrible clattering noise, and it makes everything turn. But if the power goes out, then you can flip up this little door on the side, and a crank plugs in right there. You can run it by hand. So, this is basically a Babbage difference engine Yet it was built at least as late as 1972, per a I found, and also all the pennies that fell out when I took the bottom off. Got my hand on the side, Well, it may seem hard to believe that this literally Victorian technology was still used that long. It actually dominated the market. Per this Computer World article, only $16 million of revenue that year came from, while $208 million, or 13 times more, was from mechanicals. Intriguingly, there was also $20 million in revenue from point-of-sale machines, so they were outselling plain old electronic registers. But we have to remember that at this point in time, those were enormous systems based around mainframes, which typically included no fewer than 10 checkout stations per, and they probably cost over $1 million a piece. So that number may literally represent hardware that was deployed at just 10 or 20 locations. On the other hand, we can probably safely assume that a standalone register like this cost at most $2,000 in 70s bucks. And that would mean they sold at least 100,000 registers like this, which is a mind-boggling number. It makes you wonder where they all wound up. You'd think we'd be knee-deep in these goddamn phone editors. Now, of course, they have projections that the market would shift towards electronic machines over the next couple of years, and maybe it did. That only would have applied to new sales. Turnover in this market was not enormous. While these machines made and primitive by modern standards, they did serve the purpose. Fairly reliable and repairable, believe it or not, and they definitely weren't cheap. So a lot of businesses that bought these well into the late 70s would have hung on to them as long as they kept working. Indeed, they show up in the backgrounds of plenty of movies 80s and even later, and some of the pennies I found in this thing were made as 1982. While fully electronic machines were definitely a common sight by the mid-80s, I feel comfortable guessing that they weren't truly universal until probably the early 90s. And now I can get rid of this thing. And the reason for these things is that they did do the bare minimum, which is pretty much what I showed you a few minutes ago. They let you enter prices, produce a total, in some cases calculate, produce a receipt, which is all retailers needed. Hell, even that could be overkill. Again, in a lot of places, transactions are so trivial that receipts are barely needed, and most cashiers could calculate change in their heads until fairly recently. So that just leaves the adding function, which can be achieved on a simple calculator, which is in fact what many businesses used to have. Take a look at the scene in RoboCop, for instance. This literal mom and pop convenience store has a cash drawer behind the counter, but when we see the reverse angle, there's no register there, just an electromechanical adding machine Remington ran. I might have made a mistake here, but I'm not certain. While editing, I noticed that in the corner of this shot, you actually can see a cash register. It's over on the extreme right end, but it doesn't show from any other angle, and the cash drawer we saw does appear to be beneath the adding machine, so I'm not sure what the intent was here. Like, maybe they had the register and then it broke and they couldn't afford to fix it, so they switched to the Remington. Or maybe they upgraded from the Remington to a real register, but kept it around in case they had heavy traffic and both of them need to ring people up at once. Or maybe this is an interface to keep spare cash, so they don't have to go safe in the middle of a business day, which, now that you think about it, would be pretty tough given the camouflage they set up. Or maybe this is just a movie set and doesn't make sense. In any case, it doesn't really affect my narrative, as you'll see in a moment. I just didn't want you to wonder what I was on about. Anyway, there absolutely were stores that worked this way, and I know this because I visited some as late as this, where my purchases were rung up on a plain old adding machine. They just punched in what I bought, multiplied by the local tax rate, did the change in their head. Instead of a drawer, they kept their, basically a tackle box. They had a set terminal and manually punched in the total. If you know, it still is, but only at tiny businesses. You know, places where the cashier is also the owner, where their inventory system is that they buy stuff when they run out, and where they have no employees to speak of. In that kind of business, the only thing you care about is how much was earned on a given day. And if that was how most stores worked, then maybe the cash register as we know it wouldn't exist. But in reality, most stores have at least one hired employee, and that changes everything. If I turn my machine off then back on and try to bring you up again, it's mad at me. I pressed the exact same keystrokes, but it's not happy because it wants a clerk number. That's its term for a username to prove that I'm an authorized cashier, and if so, which one? And like any user account, this serves two purposes. It allows restrictions to be placed on my actions, and it allows those actions to be logged against my name. Indeed, if I run a transaction, you can see my name is printed right at the top of the receipt. In fact, both receipts. This goes to the heart of the matter. All registers have a lot to do many over the years. The reason they were invented comes back to a simple problem. You just can't find good help. By most accounts, cash register was sold in 1879 by a guy named Brady, who gave it the incredible name Brady's Incorruptible Cashier. Now, besides one hell of a title, that name also gives us a bit of why the industry was founded, which is why it's such a shame that this story isn't actually true. In fact, everything I just said is wrong, as is virtually every source of info on this topic. I already had to fix two different wiki pages, but there's thousands of books going back decades that conflate the early history of this industry. So let's get a few things straight. First off, as badass as it sounds, this machine was not called the Incorruptible Cashier. They were devised by that name, and it was made by James Riddy, and it was very significant, but it came at least 2 models and half a year after this one. Also, people often refer to this as the Riddy dial, but nobody called it that at the time because it was never actually sold. We don't even truly know what the machine looked like. No specimens survived, and while photos like this one frequently accompany pithy pieces on the subject, they all depict replicas built decades later, which not only lack functioning mechanisms, but don't even match Riddy's patent drawings. Speaking of which, you might think that maybe the dial machine was at least the first register to be patented, but that's not true either. Not by a long shot, actually. It was beat to the punch 3 device, very cleverly named the cash recording machine. More inventions in the meantime, which didn't get patented because Riddy's own filing was titled Improvements on Cash Register, and outright states that these were well-known devices. So it's clear as mud that our records of these are murky, but some parts, truthfully enough. The legend goes, James Riddy was fried with cigars, all very popular items, but he wasn't getting a lot of money. And he suspected this was due to embezzlement. And that was probably true because avoidable contradiction. Stores need a lot of workers, but they all have to be paid like crap. Retail, after all, is kind of a terrible industry. Stores mostly just get things from manufacturers, then hang on to them until you want one, hence the term store. And that means they add very little value to their products. That, in turn, means their margins are very slim because a huge chunk of the price tag for any given item typically goes straight to the manufacturer, leaving the store very little to keep for themselves. That means the only way to make a reasonable profit is by making lots of sales. But since each one requires a lot of time and effort, especially back in the 19th century when customers needed a lot more hand-holding, stores require a lot of employees to handle their sales, and those employees are rarely paid very well, partly because of the already slim margins, but also due to the low perceived skill requirements. To most storekeepers, it is a beating heart and a pair of hands. This produces an economic pitfall so widely recognized that it actually has a name, the principal agent problem. In short, these jobs pay very poorly and have very little upwards mobility, yet the workers are expected to be trustworthy agents of the store and to uphold its interests by keeping track of sales, charging the right prices, not stealing product or allowing it to be stolen, and of course, handling vastly larger sums of money than they can ever expect to own. Obviously, this math looks pretty dumb up close, so a lot of folks then and now see the logic in skimming from the till. I won't get too deep in my opinion that, but in short, life you shouldn't steal from work for a variety of largely practical reasons. I'm not too broken up about it because I feel businesses also create the conditions that encourage theft, and that most people who steal probably don't feel like they have very many other options. No, we can debate that, but I don't want to, so don't bother. But I do want to say 2 things. First, the fact of the matter is, this is a huge problem for the retail industry. Employees Employee theft is the #1 cause of shrinkage about every report that exists. So we're going to spend the rest of this video having to tell all cashiers are thieves. This is unavoidable if these machines exist. So we have to look at it from that perspective. And it's exhausting to constantly handle, but it probably is pretty frustrating if you're a cashier. Isn't the thief, because regardless of whether you think it's immoral to steal from Target, it sucks to be treated like a criminal because you aren't a high-paying job. My feelings, and I don't default. Nonetheless, by all reports, embezzlement really was widespread by them, probably for different reasons. One was that the prospects for improving your lifestyle were much worse than they are even now. But the other is that business accounts essentially non-existent. According to books on the subject, particularly Richard Crandall's indispensable 1988 treatise, The Incorruptible Cashier, stores in the 1800s just didn't know how much money they had or what sales they'd made. Cash was kept in a simple box, sometimes called a till, but often just called the cash box, and all cashiers had free access to it. There was no way to control or record the money going in or out of it, and there wasn't even a way to know that a sale had been made unless the cashier chose to write it down in the ledger and happened to get the details right. The only piece of hard data a store owner really had was how much money was in the box to close a business, and they could track the previous day's total from that to see how much they were up for the day, but they couldn't tell how they got that figure. If they took in $30 but someone swiped 10, then it just looked like they were up 20, and who was to say otherwise? This meant that as a cashier, nothing really stopped you from pinching big wads of cash, assuming you didn't get too greedy. Obviously, if the box was down at close of business, the boss would know what had happened. But if you simply pocketed everything that customers handed you, you were probably in the clear because the boss would never know what was supposed to have been in the till. Now, of course, if he was paying some attention, like counting how many customers walked out carrying purchases, he could guess roughly how much he should have taken. You might get noticed that way, but if you were smart, then when you sold a customer an item for tell them it was $1.10, then you put the rest in the box while pocketing the spare dime, which counted for a lot more back then. And the only way you get noticed is if they come back later, buy the same item, pay only $1, and mention that you overcharged them the other day. But it probably wouldn't. So there were lots of ways to conceal theft. And on top of that, since the cash box was shared between clerks, even if the boss knew someone was stealing, he'd have a hell of a time proving who it was. It goes without saying, then, that this was a huge and widespread problem, and the only real way to solve it was to constantly watch over your cashier's shoulders. At that point, why not just do the work yourself? The whole point of employees, after all, is to free up the boss their stuff, like fill out paper and drink. But if you aren't able enough to make them trustworthy, the constant vigilance is pretty much a necessity. Ritty, however, recognizing that he couldn't be in the once, had the idea to build a medical boss, a machine to watch over his employees for him. Now, as we established, he wasn't the first to think of this, but simultaneous inventions were pretty common days, and as always, we just credit the person whose product succeeded. Though really, it ain't that just write the history books. While the dial machine never sold, Ritty's later products, including the one that was actually called the Incorruptible Cashier, that machine appeared around late 1879, and it looked a lot more like what you'd expect. In fact, its designs for almost every register sold over the next 40 years or so. So you'd think this guy's name would be pretty well known, but after a few years, he got sick of trying to make the business take off and sold the operation to another guy named John Henry Patterson, who renamed it to National Cash Register Company. They went on to sell countless millions of the things and are actually still a major player in the market as we speak. So when the day first came that someone asked who thought these things up in the first place, it was in NCR's interest to position the product they bought as the progenitor of the whole industry, especially because doing otherwise would have made their patent trolling much tougher. I may expand on this more in a future video about it, but in short, NCR functioned pretty much like the mob. They were regarded throughout the century as one of the most powerful and terrifying entities in the whole United States. Through the combination of a massive marketing campaign, the most ruthless sales tactics in the history of capitalism, and competitive practices so intense that person spending a year in jail, NCR single-handedly caused the cash register to become ubiquitous, and in doing so, redefined the face of business, as anyone who's held a job after the 19th century can attest. The modern employee, after all, veritable panopticon, where their every move, from simple time clock and video surveillance to data exfiltration detectors, you spend every minute being reminded that the company's linked. But it all seems to have started right here with this machine, or anything we're used to. It still forms the one task universal to all cash registers. It keeps the cashier honest, or more accurately, it helps you do that. Let's take a look at how the dial was probably explained, what that means. I say probably because there are no functioning specimens of the dial machine still in existence, and I haven't been able to trustworthy explanation of how it worked, just breathless puppy taken at face value. So I resorted to reading the patent, and after about a dozen trying to get it, so I roped in some friends to help, and I think, but take all this with a grain of salt. Per the patent drawings, the original series of keys labeled in 5-cent increments from 5 to 95 cents, then a dial with markings for the same value. And right away, you must have a problem because this doesn't look like the machine we've seen in the photos at all. The replicas have more keys plus a whole second hand on the dial, and this is apparent because they're based on a second version that Riddy developed. I can't find the patent. So we're just going to hope that both machines worked about the same way, and it seems to be like this. When you press one of the keys, the dial hands swing around to indicate the amount. So if you press 65 cents, the long hand swings to 65. If you then press $2, the short hand swings around to 2, and now you have $2.65 on the display. So this can display any amount of money up to $9.95, and as far as I know, the initial model was exactly the same, it just lacked the dollar keys, so it stopped at 95 cents. Of course, both those figures seem pretty limiting, but consider that $9.95 in 1879 was equivalent to like $300, and even 95 cents with 30, both of which are pretty big numbers for a single purchase at a saloon. Imagine this being used. These wouldn't have worked everywhere, but I don't think he was aiming for market dominance yet. On the other hand, the 5-cent increments seem, I haven't found any explanation for those. I can tell you this was quite common in early registers, but nobody seems to feel the no. All I can do is guess, but I have picked up a few clues. For one thing, while we think of the penny as utterly worthless today, apparently that perception is very old and had already appeared by the late 19th century. In fact, the Long Depression was just wrapping up in 1879, a fact I only just learned when I paused writing the script to watch Tasting History with Max Miller. In the late 1800s, the U.S. Mint was already struggling to produce pennies without taking a loss, and people apparently hated carrying them around, so it may be the case that a lot of stores just priced everything in multiples of 5 cents to simplify matters. The trouble with that is the general exchange rate from now is around 32 times, so nickels would effectively have forced prices to be $1.50, $3, $4.50, and which are pretty big. About the pennies, there was a lot of stuff you could buy for a cent, and indeed, when NCR began making these machines, they quickly introduced models with 1 cent increments, often referred to as candy shop machines, for what should be obvious reasons. The trouble is, they're only useful at candy shops because they couldn't specify amounts larger than about 25 cents. Most stores thus would have needed the 5-cent models, and the idea that those places bring up intermediate prices seems preposterous to me. I feel like I must be missing something here because NCR continued selling 5-cent registers for decades. So all I did in the store is just rounded everything up or down, make it work, and for anything less than 5 cents, they just didn't care enough to put it through the register at all. But that feels shady. So if anyone has more info on this, I'd love to hear. Anyway, using this machine is incredibly simple. It doesn't actually do any calculations. Each press of the key represents a complete transaction. So each time you handle a sale, you add the items in your head, then pre-label the total. The hand on the dial swings around the amount you press. Every time a bell rings, swings around to the new, the bell rings again, and that's it. That's all the machine does, at least on the outside. The inside is a different matter. to the back of the dial is a hidden count discs numbered from 0 to 9, and then one more numbered in 5-cent increments, so dollars and cents. Each time you press a key on the register, it also adds that value to the counter. So as each transaction is completed, the value accumulates up to $99,999.95, an amount we can safely assume no store ever handled at this point in time, but hey, it was future-proof. So at this point, it should be clear that there are two different methods called improvements on indicator and register. As I understand it, the dial is the indicator, meaning it shows a current value, while the counter is the register, a term which at the time referred to an indelible log of events. So it's like this. During the working day, the dial shows the value of each transaction as it happens. So if you're getting 5 cents, then see 65 on the dial, that's how much to pay. But at the end of each business day, the store owner visits the register, opens the case with the key, reads the counter, and sees the post to be taken in. He can then count the cash from the till, subtract the previous day's balance, so swipe it. Oh man! If they match, however, then all the money that was supposed to be there is, and he can then read the counter, and that's all there is. It seems pretty self-explanatory, right? You can see how it's a problem, and it's so straightforward that you wonder why it wasn't invented, or at least adopted sooner. And of course, we can say that about a lot of inventions, but an important detail is that, like many simple solutions to complex social problems, this doesn't actually work. I mean, not that it doesn't do what it says it does. What I mean is that it does nothing to solve the underlying problem. In fact, I think it's disingenuous that so many accounts of the industry simply assert that the introduction of these devices changed everything, when in reality, the machines themselves did nothing. The register, after all, isn't actually an authority figure. The products being sold aren't locked up until the transaction happens. So this doesn't force the cashier to behave because they can simply choose not to use it. I mean, you have to understand, when you walked into a bar in 18, quote you a price, take your money, and then just pocket it. Like, this seems astonishing now, but I mean, the cash box was at one end of the bar. He might be at the other. So he'd just collect money as he went. And when he got back that way, he'd empty his pockets into the till. So if that's what, why would you notice or care that he hadn't done anything with the funky clock-looking gadget behind the bar? I mean, you obviously wouldn't. And that's a real problem, because someone, after all, has to keep the cashier honest. I'm missing floating around about exactly how this was achieved. It's broadly acknowledged that in order for registers to be effective, their use had to be enforced, but people seem widely mistaken about exactly how this was done. You'll recall I said that this register had a bell that sounded with each transaction, and yes, that's the origin of the phrase "to ring up a sale." But there's a notion promulgated through many lazy retellings of the story that the purpose of that bell is to alert the store a sale had occurred. I have a lot of no, it's just false, and I know it. But let's explore that in your head, right? If you imagine that there is always somewhere in the building, or a distant corner of the sale floor, or maybe in a back room, where he might notice if a long period of time goes by without any bells sound, that would prompt him to go snoop around the counter to see what's going on. But okay, for one thing, this assumes that he knows how often the bell should be ringing. If the fish just aren't biting today, how's he going to know that? And if there is risk business, then is he really going to notice the difference between a ding every 10 minutes and one per 8? Of course not. So all the cashier has to do is fail to ring up every third transaction, and nothing will seem amiss. But even that's already because the bell only said a transaction occurred, not how much it was for. So nothing stops the clerk from asking the customer for 50 cents, pressing 25 to produce the ding, and then pocketing the difference. And I could list a lot more threat models here to get the idea. It clearly isn't practical for the store owner to enforce use of the register. If, it's there, remember that storekeepers sometimes have to leave the store. That's why we all know what it means to mind the shop, right? And if every time you left, all your clerks have a nice 1 hour free-for-all cash buffet, then won't be fixing anything. So the whole idea that the bell is what owners say is nonsense, and we know this because Ritty's patent said as much. To wit, connected with the machine is a bell or other sounding device, which is often keys are moved sufficiently to indicate their respective values, so that if the bell or other alarm is not sounded, the customer is aware that the amount paid has not been properly recorded by the clerk. In other words, Rick didn't make a machine to police his cashiers. He made one that helps you. That's the whole reason, so you can see across the bar, so you knew how much the cashier had entered, and so you'd be able to tell if he was pulling any strings. If 25 cents pressed 15, or took your money without putting anything into the register, then you knew he was pilfering. You could either call him out on the spot or put everyone in the world a cop now. And not, right? After all, if the cashier is adding 10 and you're paying more for everything, they're charging the right amount and pocketing it, that hurts too, because we're not talking about Walmart here. Our modern, hypermassive corporate chains are so wealthy and so hell-bent on having footprint in as many places as possible that they can and will eat the cost of even enormous amounts of theft. But in 1879, if the clerks at your local saloon or shoe store were pocketing half the profits, at some point you just wouldn't have one of those anymore. So you had an interest in the store remaining solvent, and consumers in the 19th century knew all this, so it probably wasn't a huge lift to get them to play ball. The trouble was, they had to be told what exactly was expected of them. The register couldn't be useful unless everybody knew how it worked, and apparently that took some doing. One approach was, I guess, to just put up a sign explaining how the new system worked, and that was still happening even as late as the 1930s. Some machines had these enormous Far Cry style tutorials printed on the back, which is very funny, but as anyone who's worked retail knows, customers don't read signs. For this new system to work, society had to be saturated with messaging about your new responsibilities, and who better than National Cash Register Company to solve that problem? They had the oomph not only to convince the public to expect these things everywhere, but also to convince store owners in both, with gusto. A massive marketing campaign, magazines instructed shopkeepers that if they didn't have a register, they were in consumer publications, instructed customers of every store to that point. We haven't addressed receipts yet, largely because Brady's first machine didn't produce them, but a historical curiosity because it's not really clear why it didn't. Receipts, after all, are an incredibly important part of this system, and also much older than you might realize. I mean, if we want to be pedantic, they go back forever. Some of the earliest examples of written language were recorded in literal cuneiform, but those were still made by human hands, so they were subject to falsification. Here, we're talking about automatic receipts, the sort we're used to nowadays. These are printed by a cash register at the same moment that the amount paid is recorded, so they represent an indisputable record of what was entered into the machine. And that idea also goes back forever, to the beginning of the cash register itself. This guy here, the cash recording machine, which I mentioned earlier, was the earliest known register to be patented back in 1866, and it did print receipts. Two of them, in fact. The first one was the receipt proper, the printed to the customer, but the other was a roll of paper sealed inside the machine, which recorded the amount of every transaction in a continuous log known as a journal. And this was a huge upgrade over Brady's approach. It doesn't give the sum of the day's take like his machine did, but the owner could easily obtain that by just adding up the values on the journal. In exchange for this slight inconvenience, he got a detailed record of each transaction, and meanwhile, the customer got their own record, which this was useful for resolving disputes. If the customer claimed they were charged more money than was owed or were given the wrong change, then the receipt plus the journal plus the balance in the cash box could prove their case. Because again, the cashier was seen as a villain by both parties here, and the register as a tool to combat the clerks for larceny. The receipts, plural, were the final nail in their coffin, as illustrated in this 1913 NCR ad. They sold this as a three-pronged system, where the customer's receipt proved what they'd been charged, the registers and journal counters proved how much the store was owed, and the journal proved that the cashier had entered each sale correctly, giving all three parties proof of their good faith. Though, of course, this was a little disingenuous. disingenuous because, after all, the clerk wasn't actually allowed to have their receipt inside the machine where they couldn't tamper it, but they could see it. Going back drawing, notice that you can see the journal tape because it's mounted inside a glass cabinet, and that's not efficient. This was a critical design element that's actually mentioned in the patent. Now, they don't say why it's used, but I think it speaks for itself. The glass allows the journal to be seen as a closed-circuit surveillance warning. The employee sees it, so they never forget that everything they do is being recorded, and the customer sees it, so they know that everything is being recorded, and by now you can see it to a point. Just like the cash recording machine, the Royal Register produces two receipt transactions, one for the customer and a second sealed inside the machine where only the manager can get. The cashier can still see, forget that, and it goes on their permanent record. And this is actually still a feature on Royal Registers at least as late as 2015, years later. Because things have never changed. The same frustrations, still cashiers are still paid poorly and they still don't have much up. Skimming still looks very appealing and there are still ways to do it. The next time you go to a McDonald's drive-thru, for instance, take a look on the window and you'll probably see that says, if you aren't offered a seat, your meal is free. That's because people are still running the same old scam. You buy 3 McMuffins, then pull up to the window, hand the guy $10 in cash. And if he doesn't offer you a receipt, that might be because he just never rang those up and the $10 went in his pocket. Of course, we're talking about McDonald's here, so it's very possible your reaction is, hey, good for him. And I think the company knows that. That's probably why a phone number to call to report your suspicions. They offer to comp your whole meal. They're probably aware that most people aren't paying much attention in the drive. Very few care about getting a receipt at all, and even fewer feel so strongly about someone stealing from Beanies that they actually take the time to make a phone call. But probably a lot more people would do it for $10. A lot still wouldn't, though. So McDonald's takes even more precautions. You'll recall that I had to log into my Royal Register, and the same happens at McDonald's. Every cashier has to sign in, and every action they take is recorded alongside their name. So if the manager gets suspicious, they can compare each cashier's sales record to, say, the number of cars reported in the drive-thru, and if there's a big difference, then they know who to start watching. And this, too, is nothing new. By the early 20th century, cash registers had become a lot more sophisticated. Rather than just press wholesale, they included features to add up totals and sometimes even calculate change. They also added buttons to identify which was using a machine, allowing management to track who was selling what and when. And they even built machines with multiple drawers. So if several cashiers were working at one station, they didn't have access to it. That way, if there was an imbalance, you knew exactly which employee was. Now, I'm not sure how they prevented a cashier from just pressing someone else's button and doing scams in their name. There was some solution, but this is where it runs aground because there's almost no info on this era of registers. There are many interesting details about early registers, which are in a later video, but heard all the important parts. There are only about 5 core elements to a cash register, and they are as follows. The ability to enter a sales amount either as a sum or a series of items, a visible indicator of the total which the customer can see, automatic receipts, and a journal log, and a secure pattern that tracks. These all became universal very quickly to its inception, except for the ability to calculate the total from separate items. I think that pretty long time to show up, but it had appeared by the early 20th century, which is pretty much where they live. These are still, which is why I was able to take this register out of the box to start using it. All I had to do was figure out basic features were because they all work more or less the same every register, 8-way transistors. Though that was a pretty chaotic event. When electronics appeared in this market, it basically split into 2 evolutionary paths. One was for the new computerized point-of-sale systems, which added a lot of elaborations and features that were very useful for running stores, but weren't directly related to the handling of money. That was pretty much a solved problem, so they did that part very, very much like the machines they were replacing. But then there was a second track for the electronic cash register, register, which was more or less an evolution of its mechanical forebears, adding a bunch of peripheral features like the PS. These stuck and did trickle over from their sister industry. They only show forms. For a case in point, let's finally go back to the Royal, and I'll give you a choice. This is a very typical specimen of mid-90s register, and right off the bat, you'll guess that it isn't a PC. I mean, honestly, it's barely even a computer. There are no general-purpose inputs, for instance, other than the numeric keypad. All the other keys are specialized actions for void, return, subtotal, that sort of thing. And while this 4x5 grid of department keys also serves as alphabetic inputs, they're only for defining department and clerk names. And also, 4x5 is only 20 keys. So if you want any letters past T, you'll have to press department shift before each one. And we'll show you what that looks like later, because it's actually even more tedious than it sounds. Then on the output side, we have a couple 7-segment vacuum fluorescent displays with 2 rows each. One is for prices and quantities, and the other is for very rudimentary text. Also, I realize it's probably very hard to see these VFD displays. I don't know what to do about that. There doesn't be a brightness control anywhere, so hopefully you can read them. And of course, we have 2 separate screens. One faces stock, so you can face it towards the customer. And that's all their video output, if you call it that. Then finally, we have the receipt printer or printers we already met. Though I would like to take a moment to insult. While the whole dual printer thing is pretty neat, it sucks. And while some of that is probably due to the new old stock ink ribbons I got, which are surely a little dried out, I suspect it wasn't much better when new, because I remember getting receipts like this, and they always felt cheap and dismal. In fact, when I was growing up, I remember that the width of a receipt seemed to say a lot about where it came from. Nowadays, almost everyone uses the same 3.5-inch thermal paper, so no matter where you go, you get a nice, crisp, readable printout. 20 years ago, however, you only saw that from major chains. Most chains used 2.5 mil and sometimes dot matrix, and the readability was often a lot crummier, especially if they used 2-ply carbonless paper and handed you the yellow copy. Those were often barely legible. But the 1.5-inch stuff, like we have here, that was always dot matrix, and it always looked like crap. The paper quality itself always seemed to be really poor. The text was usually a very mimeograph-esque purple that often bled and smeared, and you pretty much only got these from really tiny businesses. By the time I had money to spend, they only showed up at stores and equally smelly thrift shops. So I always saw them as a marker of a place I didn't want to go back to. Anyway, though, weird classes on the side, that's it for the machine's hardware. There's no sockets on it. You can't plug in a barcode scanner or anything. There's no floppy drive or network interfaces. But again, this is only a shot as a computer, which it really isn't by most standards. I'll prove this. When this machine arrived, it was pretty dirty. It had dust and fluff packed into every crevice. So I had to clean it. And it turns out this motherboard looks like. Half of the couple dumb logic ICs, plus this enormous custom chip that's printer and fluorescent display driver, maybe a chunk of ROM that stores the firmware. We have the CPU, which isn't even a CPU, as it turns out. A microcontroller from Mitsubishi, and okay, sure, that is a computer, but it's the kind you'd put in a thermostat. And as for storage, there's none to speak of, at least none that isn't volatile. While this thing does have a bunch of settings, it doesn't have an EEPROM, let alone flash memory to store them. The configuration and internal accounting are all kept in a single static RAM chip, storing all of 256 kilobits. That's kept alive when the machine is unplugged by a big old lithium battery that's clearly been hastily replaced at some point in this thing's life. Next to that, it just forgets everything it ever knew and goes back to factory default. A button in the printer department to do just that, which presumably powers to the RAM chip. These are characteristics you'd expect to find in, a talking Darth Vader helmet, the simplest digital devices you could build in the mid-90s. And the reason it's so simple is because it does so little. It's really not a padding machine. Now, I heard it once or twice in this video, and you might think it's just an archaic name for a powder but that's only sort of true. Originally, adding machines were a sort of mechanical deal used for financial work, and over time largely went by the wayside, but that type of machine still exists. Some people still call them by the old name. This is one such device, and while it may look like a normal calculator at first, if you stare for a minute, you start to notice some odd things. For instance, the add track keys have equal signs on them. There's a button here with 2 zeros. There's a grand total key over here. And then there's this slide switch here, which lets you pick a fixed decimal precision. Now, this point, like any other modern calculator, and internally it always will digit precision, but that makes sense. So, if you slide this over 2, it always rounds the output to even pick which direction you want it to count, up or down. There's also a bunch of special features for stuff like doing arithmetic with time or multiplying by a standard tax rate. So more of these things than you probably. This video isn't about that. I wanted to describe how to put numbers on them. See, while the keypad does have a decimal point, you're not really supposed to use it because that's numbers. Say the amounts of all your credit cards for the day. So instead, the first 2 digits you enter in cents component, and the rest as dollars. If you want to enter a $1.25, you punch in 5. For $10, you type 1000. If you're entering a long series of whole dollar amounts, you can quickly enter 2 zeros with the 2 zeros button. So for $5, it's just 5 double 0. Right? Right. Well, the same thing applies on this and every other register. So if I want to ring you up for $6.75, I just punch in 675, and it adds the decimal point implicitly. We even have the double 0 button. So this thing is clearly optimized for entering dollar and cent values. And this is another really important difference that I see between a register and POS. Point systems, as you'll see when I eventually get to the video about them, are all-encompassing. They don't just want to handle money, they want to understand what you're selling and visualize price updates, discount and coupon management, sales trend analysis, inventory reordering, and all that stuff is useful, but for any to work, you have to give every single item you sell stock keeping number, or you. Systems is sometimes called a product lookup number. Either way, you usually can't walk up to a POS machine and just punch in a dollar amount to charge to the customer because you know exactly what you're selling, not just how much of it. Cash registers are not like this. The furthest the Royal goes into inventory management is that they're mostly sell muffin those PLU instead of the full price. You change the PLU and then you use the new price the next time someone punches in 5. And there's also a little bit of reporting available on this. The machine can tell you how much 5 sold today, but it's very basic and so you go to 4 digits. So to all you grocery workers out there, patient, sorry, no bananas today. Royal said, what this machine does get, however, are departments. And these are actually a feature in virtually every electronic register, some of the higher end mechanical ones. Has like 20 department keys on here, plus a shift button. So when you can put it into any of the categories, and that a few different things. One, the machine does generate some very basic reports, so you can see roughly how things are selling each day on a per department basis. And I suppose if your store had 40 items or less, you could just assign a department to each one and keep track that way. In fact, there's even a way to direct it to a department key. So if I press L, that brings up a lighter in a single keystroke. It's very convenient. Mostly, however, you're going to use these departments. If you're a convenience store, that's things like general merch, beverages, cold food, hot food, alcohol, etc. And this actually explains why the feature is so universal, because several of those things are defined by their tax rates. In the US, for instance, non-prepared or cold food is untaxed. So you'd always get a category for that. And then things like alcohol, tobacco, and gasoline are all going to have their own rates. Then if you have a general sales tax in your state, you'll need to apply that as well. So the tax rates are assigned by departments. You might need 4 or 5 departments to make this all work. Now, there's a little complexity to setting that up, and I'll show you what I need later, but a lot wouldn't actually need to do it. If I was in Oregon, for instance, which has no sales tax, and I was running a store that didn't sell alcohol, gas, etc., then I could just take this out of the box, turn it on in Department 1. And even if you do have to set it up, it's fast in configuring a point-of-sale system, and either way, once the departments are configured, they're, once again, just a place to store dollars and cents. If I want to ring up some sunglasses, I don't need to tell the register that's what I'm selling. I just put $1.50 in general merch, and that's that. And for most transactions, that's all the items the customer is buying. Then hit subtotal. That gives you the final price with tax. You say that out loud. The customer chooses how they're going to pay, and that's that. Oh, it costs more than that. Oops. Well, now's a good time to discuss tenders. Not those. Tender is the industry term for taking your money. Your type is a form of money. This register supports types: cash, check, and 2 types of credit. The default is cash bucks. I just entered 50, press total. It interprets it as cash, so your change appears on both screens, so I know how much to give you, and you know how much to expect. And for most, all you'll need to do, but there are some common exceptions. One is split tenders. No, not those. A split tender is when you hand the clerk $5 in cash, then move the rest on the card. And I don't even know how to do that. It works exactly how you expect. But an interesting deal is that it works even with redundant. So here's the $5 and the rest is cash. The drawer doesn't open because the full total has to be paid, which is $6. So if you wanted to put that on a card, I could just run it for the remaining amount, press charge, and that zeroes out the total and opens the drawer. But suppose you changed your mind. After we put in the $5, you look at your wallet and realize you don't have your card, and the only other bill you have is $20. So you hand me that, I enter 20, hit total, and the register gives change for what's left of the 20. Now, it makes perfect sense that this works, but it feels weird to me. Like, I kind of figured you'd expect me to clear the entry and put the cash all in at once, but it doesn't really care. However, there are some details about different tender types that I found very odd, at least at first. For instance, let's ring you up for $10 again, and now you hand me a credit card. If I now tell the register that I'm going to run $20 on the card, it gets mad. It won't accept that because it's over the sale. In other words, this machine gets cash back on a card transaction. That's presumably because we're using the industry definition of credit card, that is Visa, MasterCard, Amex, etc. While those can be tied to bank accounts, they're often liquid lines for which it's illicit to extract cash without paying a hefty advance. Now, the retailer can't tell the difference between credit and debit pieces, so they just any of them. It is permissible on debit cards, but I think you have to set that up as a separate tender type. It's not available out of the box. So all this makes sense, but what was weird to me is that it means on all you Europeans out there are about to hit the macro on your keyboard that types out, haha, silly Americans still using checks. But in short, no. Personal checks for decades. I've heard that old people still use them, mostly at grocery stores, and choose to accept them as a value-added service, specifically because it sets them apart. But I haven't even seen a check in almost 20 years. We didn't accept them at either of my jobs. Anyone attempting to pass one was quietly assumed to be a fraudster, and this was largely status quo even by the 90s. But at the time this thing was made, there were still a lot of businesses choosing to accept them. So, yeah. It takes checks. In fact, it has a very special feature just for that purpose. You see, when a cashier accepts a check, they're expected to record the transaction number on the back so it can be associated to a sale on the journal. But this is error prone, so the machine can do it for you instead. Now I don't have any checks because I'm under the age of 80, so we'll get some paper here. A check. All right, so I ring up. I give you your subtotal. All right, that's going to be $11. So check for that amount. I hit the button. It prints a receipt. I tear this off and hand it to you, and then I take your check and stick it in this big slot you've been wondering about for the whole video. This slot guides the check in between the print head and the receipt paper so that it cuts the ink that we know twice, and it prints a single line identifying the date, the time, the transaction number, tender type it was, and then actually changes so it prints the clerk ID and the register number if that's important to you. But let's go back to this change thing. Suppose I bring up $10 of merch, and then I tell it $20 on check. It activates change, which I'm now expecting you out of the drawer. And I had some trouble with this at first. I thought maybe I'd configured something wrong, but as I thought about it, I started to remember that people cash back on checks, just like you can on debit cards. If you needed some cash to buy weed, you something at the store for $10, write a check for $30, and the store difference in legal tender. That was a foreign country. In any case, though, that covers the whole process of taking money. You've seen everything that's needed for a typical transaction. So, welcome to your new job at Quick Stop. You're here forever. Of course, you might get promoted to order someday. That's a cashier who has quasi-managerial responsibilities for little to no extra pay. So, just in case that happens, we should cover a few advanced features. Everything I've pressed has been for putting money into the machine, but there are some buttons for taking it out, namely void and return. The first one you use during a transaction or remove an unwanted item. So I add $5 of malt liquor. That's unleaded gas, but isn't that what I said? Then I enter another one by accident.
You're funny.
I can now hit void to just undo the last item, but critically, voids don't make the item disappear. They just add another line with a negative value. So the price is nullified. The fact that the item was rung up and then removed is still recorded. And we won't get into it, but this is also to prevent a particular class of scam. Now, the return option works exactly the same way, except it's intended to reverse sales that happen in an early transaction. And this would commonly be part of a sale, like returning $20 of butter, $10 of merch. I put those both on the same ticket, and now when I hit total, all of $12. So the refund acts as a credit towards your purchase, and if you don't use it all, you get the rest in cash. Now, what's odd about this is that both features work exactly the same way, meaning I can void an item that was never rung up. Like, we have an empty ticket right now, okay? I haven't rung anything up, but if I enter $10 and void that, then hit total, I now owe you $11 on an otherwise empty sale, which seems like an oversight on Royal's part. I can't imagine why. It does make a point, because both of these sound like pretty high-level features. You might think that they're like looking back at the transaction history. No, they don't do anything. All they do is put a minus sign next to the next item you ring up and then store the amount in a separate internal counter, a point we'll come back to later. Next up, we have a few options for discounts. The first being the coupon key. If I ring you up for $20 and then I punch in 10 and hit coupon, it puts a minus 10 on the receipt and applies that amount to the whole transaction as if you handed me a $10 bill to pay towards your total. The plus or minus buttons, however, apply markups to individual items. So suppose you're buying lunch, right? It's $10 and you want to give me a $2 tip. So I put in the money, then I hit 20+%, and it adds 20% or $2 to the last item. That way I can put your $2 in the drawer without it being off at the end of the day. And of course, we wouldn't even have this problem in the first place if I could just put the tip in my pocket, since it's, mine. But remember, cashiers can't be pocketing money. That's a no-no. So it goes in the drawer, and I'll get it back later in my paycheck. Little hint, by the way. Might not get it back later. Look up the phrasing sometime. Great read. Now, on the flip side, if there's a coupon or a sale going on for, say, 25% off snowshoes, then I can just put in your snowshoes. That's the biggest thing I've ever put up on here. Then I type in 25% and hit minus, and it knocks that much off the price. And that's it for the discount. Just tell the machine how much to add, or it does it. I think this is yet another illustration of how registers and point of sale systems differ. POS systems were designed for much larger businesses, massive chains and whatnot. In that environment, it's a too much for a manager to really have any idea how much money, or can they simply be expected to review the sales journal every day for anomalies. Target just doesn't allow cashiers to mark things down by our amounts because that would result in a lot of theft very quickly from people selling stuff to their friends at a 95%. A lot of guardrails like this. Coupons and discounts all have to be, along with a list of items applied to. And then they're typically applied either automatically when those items sell or when the operator scans a barcode from an approved coupon. In some cases, cashiers can apply a discount up to a certain amount to any item, but after usually like 10 or 15% max, they need manager approval. There are sometimes hard limits on what's going to be used in a single transaction, and overuse can actually trigger investigation, albeit rarely. In the ancient tradition of the cash register, there's a lot of surveillance and paranoia going on. Here, however, there's none of that because you're probably working directly under the owner who handles the inventory and accounting and is probably going to notice if there's a lot of money. And again, everything you do is recorded. So all you have to do is skim through the journal tape to find out if you've been issuing a lot of deep discounts. Then you get a stern talking to or a stern walk out the door. You might think a stern set of cuffs would follow as well, but the one time I was present and caught skimming, the boss just made him get money back in exchange for not calling the cops and fired him. And I figured that's probably how it goes, because it's just a big pain in the ass to police and going to court and all that crap. Workers at the time and staff, but my paw just wonder as no. With that said, however, sometimes an employee does need to take money out. To that end, we have 3 final features. The first is no sale. Press this, it just pops the drawer, and this is what you do if you would say paid the wrong change or forgot to deposit a check, that sort of thing. Critically, however, you're never going to change what's in the drawer during a no sale unless you all up putting in or moving money and just correcting it. If you need to add or move money outside of the sale, you need to use the PO and RA buttons. If you're paid out and received account, these are basically short tenders, not about bringing up any items. And all the use cases of these are things you never see happen in a corporate chain. For instance, small businesses sometimes have store accounts, or at least they used to. A store account is basically a credit line offered to local businesses that seem reasonable, so that employees can make purchases without needing to carry around a company credit card. And in the early 20th century, these were so common that there was a whole market for little tiny cabinets made just to hold credit slips. Your local grocery store might even let you open a tab. It was a weird time. We actually had these at my first job, and our system was literally a metal box cards that we'd write the name of a business on, along with a number of authorized individuals. If someone wanted to make a purchase on behalf of their boss, they just give us the company name, show ID, and we'd write the amount on the card. Then periodically the boss would come in and hand us a check to pay it off. That was quaint, but very anachronistic. By 2007, I think we might have been one of the last businesses still doing this. And I imagine if you work at a grocery or a department store, you've never heard of it. When this machine was first sold, however, I imagine it was still kind of common, at least in like little local hardware. So periodically, when an account has a balance owed, the business owner will come in and pay it. And if your boss isn't in, they're going to hand the cash or check to you. And even though that isn't a sale per se, the money still has to go in the drawer because that's the only safe place for it. So you hand me $300. That's 30. There we go, 300. And I press receive on account. I stick the cash in the drawer. The register records that $300 was added, and I can hand you a receipt for this, but it's not a sales transaction. It's just a generic record that money came in. And the same goes in reverse. Say the roofers just finished re-roofing the place and they need to get paid. The boss isn't around, and I don't have the authority to use the company checkbook. So I put in $300. I get paid out. It pops in the drawer. I start taking out an awful lot of money. I pretty much clear out my entire drawer. I give you a receipt, and there you go. Straightforward. Well, that's the thing. Pretty straightforward. You gotta notice this machine literally has two verbs: add a drawer and remove from the drawer. There's a dozen ways to do it, really different in terms of which text appears on the receipt and which counters the money goes into. Machine from James Ready had a counter that recorded how much money passed through it. While those continued to be a thing, even as receipts and journals became prevalent. If the classic cash register you see in a saloon in a Western, they always have that curved front panel. Well, that's actually a lid, which you can unlock with a key to read the internal counters. And this was something you do either at the end of the day or in the middle to see how things are going so far. And those counters still exist today. Just, of course, these being electronic, there's a lot more of them, and they're no longer physical. They're just stored in memory. So to see them, you have to add the machine for a report. To do that, we need to go to reporting mode, but that means I have to explain the mode. The one control on the machine that I've been conspicuously avoiding so far is this key switcher. This switches between various operational modes and which modes I can access. They're labeled Reg, Z, and Program, and they match up with the modes on the switch. So if I put in the Reg key, I can turn those to Reg 1, Reg 2, and X, but not to Z and not to Program. If I put in the Z key, it'll do everything up to Z, but it won't do Program. And if I put in Program, then it'll do everything. Now I'll explain what all these modes do, but in short, these privilege levels map pretty directly to common roles in a small store, namely owner, key holder, and cashier. There's actually a fourth level of sorts, but we'll get to that as we go through the modes. Those two are Reg 1, Reg 2, which are for normal day-to-day sales. We've been in Reg time, but the sole difference between the two is that in Reg 2, the machine doesn't print receipts. And the manual doesn't explain why you use this mode, but I assume it's just don't want receipts, so it's just a waste of paper. But I think this is a good point to pause and revisit that topic, because now that you've had time to digest my earlier diatribe, there's probably some points you'd like to bring up. So I spent probably an hour of this video explaining the role in this whole dance. I told you that as the customer, you have a sacred duty handed down by God himself, that is, National Cash Register Company, to watch the clerk's every move, make sure the total they give you matches what's on the register, to always get a receipt, and to report any signs of trickery to the management. Did you know you were supposed to be doing any of that? I feel like probably not, right? Chances are, for any transaction less than like $50, you don't even expect a receipt. Who's teaching that anymore? Maybe you have a parent admonishing you to always get a receipt, but most of us probably rolled our eyes at that. Like, yeah, Dad, I need a receipt for a $5 hamburger, sure. Or if you do always get a receipt, it's probably because you've actually gotten burned large to a long amount. Now, that has happened, and I was glad I got a receipt. But in that and pretty much every case I can think of, it was a good faith. I just screwed up and pressed the wrong button. And that's not surprising, because even if I did get the cashier with bars, it's not like they can screw me over anyway, because I was paying with a card. How about that? I'm sure a lot of you are wondering exactly how any of this screen didn't work anymore when everyone just uses screen. And for the most part, you're right. At least in the cash is used for less than a fifth of our transactions. This is apparently less up, where more than 50% of sales are in cash. So I wonder if this is still either way. It's true that if you're using a card, you pretty much can't screw you over. I mean, sure, there are techniques for stealing credit cards, like scammers or just memorizing the numbers, but that's very different from what we've been talking about. It's tougher, there's higher stakes, requires more prep and infrastructure, and it leaves a huge paper trail. So it's actually have to really know what you're doing. So while card theft is rampant, or can solve, and it's intended to solve, he's only theft of cash. So as it's used over the last 4 years, embezzlement has become a version of a problem. This is we spent the front half of the 20th century training everyone to fear the cashier. A tagline I'm shocked NCR never died out completely, which isn't really shocking, as registered journals have become more detailed, closed circuit surveillance has become more pervasive, and plastic has displaced cash. It's probably easier now to just take stock and fence it than to bother stealing money directly. To win, I've made purchases at Best Buy on 3 separate occasions for high dollar items turned out to have been unsealed and expertly resealed in either the stock room or a central warehouse. And I love to put the ancient meme about this up on the screen, but unfortunately it uses an all Spanish word. So, you know. But the point, I've been genuinely defrauded $5 by 3 different employees. So at this opened the box and made sure it is what it says it is, without veracity of a cash register transaction. I think the first time I ever really thought about that was I read Rick Crandall's book. In fact, as I grew up, I felt like the cashier's was the meaningless one. It was the thing preventing me from running, and the clerk was just a fun thing to release my stuff. And to an extent, pervasive even in smaller businesses, and all of them are upset. At this point, even relatively tiny stores don't want anything to leave without going through the system, because it would throw off their numbers. So at this point, a visibly higher priority. Embezzlement seemingly a solved problem, the cash itself has taken a back seat. And most modern systems are tangibly more concerned with getting your loyalty number, asking for a donation for the Bajoran War Orphans Fund, and selling you an extensive warranty on your big lighter than with actually handling money and producing a record of same. And why not? Because really, that last part is perfunctory now. Point, assuming you aren't counting the pennies on every purchase to stick within a strict budget, you probably would notice if the cashier had their pole sign turned around so you couldn't see your total. And with the strong push for paperless everything over the last couple decades, most businesses now act proactively. If you even want of a switch disables them outright, makes perfect sense now. But I suspect if this thing in even the mid-80s did not have had this feature. It's one thing to have a button that disables the receipt for just one transaction. I'm pretty sure I've seen machines from the era. The whole mode that can be switched on, left on, suggests that by the time sold, the expectation of a receipt was already declined. But it was certainly not yet dead. And I chose to pause and tell you all this info now, detail here, to remind us that while things change, they also stay the same. Let me show you something about this mode switch. If I put the key in, then rotate it to say program, I can't take it back out. It's captive until I turn it off again. And this is meant to keep you from walking away and leaving the machine in a vulnerable state. But notice that both off and Reg 1 have elongated keyways. So I can put the key in, turn it on, and take it back out. And this creates some sort of a fourth privilege level. I said earlier that the different keys map to roles like store owner, key holder, cashier, etc. But those all assume you're trusted to hold some kind of key at all. If you've been there for at least a few months and you haven't done anything amiss, then the boss might give you your own wrench key so you can at least turn the thing on in the morning. And if you know your customers rarely want receipts, then you can also put it in wrench 2 to save a little time and paper. But if you're the FNG who just hired on, you aren't getting your own key at all. Someone's going to turn the machine on for you in the morning, then pull their key out and just leave it in mode 1. That means you're stuck printing a receipt for every sale because the customers will take them and keeping you just that little bit more on your toes. Anyway, that was a real shaggy dog explanation, but the rest will go a bit quicker. The next 2 settings are called X X and Z, and an awful lot of people who
I have no idea what you mean by a shiny dog.
exactly what they did. Now, both modes generate daily reports. In other words, they spit out the values of all those internal counters I mentioned, and both options output the exact same data. But there's one important difference, which I'll tell you later. First, let's put it in X. Put it in H! Now, when we hit total, the machine spits out a very long receipt with a report on the day's sales. We'll just give this bit. So first off, we have 70 items in general merch totaling $204. That's number one, 4 temperatures for so on and so forth. Then we have the part of all this summed up, coupons, discounts, add-ons. Then the net, which is everything including the tax, coupons, and discounts. The amounts of refunds and voids, and that's useful for identifying certain types of fraud. Then we have the gross, which I don't really understand. That, I think, is a combination of all of this before the refunds and voids. I don't really know what the point of that is, but there it is. But then we have the tender breakdown, which shows how much money was taken in. And this is sort of the most important figure of the whole slip. Remember that of the cash register was to tell you how much money till at the end of the day. And they still do that. Verifying the contents of the drawer or balancing it is still an essential part of the daily routine at every store. At close of business or trusted cashier. So you open the drawer, count out all the cash, all the credit slips, all the checks, add each one up, and make sure that they match what's on the report. And this is why it's so important that the tenders are tracked separately, because if the register is out of whack because someone forgot to actually use credit card, well, that part is a little tough. Since the drawer doesn't end the day empty. So for your counting, you need to know how much. And you could do this by taking the total amount for the day of the report where it's been done for. The drawer is exactly sounds like. It tells you how much should be in the drawer. When you first set the machine up, you tell it the amount that you're loading in. And forever afterwards, it keeps a running tally so that at any moment you can ask it how much cash should be present. And I do mean any moment. You can ask for CID check at any time of day, which is really useful if, for instance, screw-up who keeps giving people the wrong change. Suppose a customer gives you $10 on a $5 sale. You give them $5 back, and they say, "Hey, I handed it, you owe me another 10." This could be the swapperoo, the oldest trick in the book. So you can't take them at their word, which would make this a stalemate, except that you told the register they gave you a 10, a fact you both know because it's printed on the receipt. So if it was a 20, then the drawer will be over by $10, and thus all you have to do is count out the drawer and compare it to the CID to resolve this dispute. And this sounds like a huge pain, but trust me, I screwed this up regularly at my jobs, so I can tell you, once you get good at it, it really doesn't take that long, especially if you're only counting bills. $5, 10, 15, 25, 50, 100, $50. 50, 200, 100, 225, 250. No, sir, you're a liar. So the CID value is incredibly useful and important, but it does require you you track all the money going in and out perfectly. You can't take or leave a city without recording it, and that means that if your drawer is running low due to, say, performing a bunch of refunds and you need to replenish it from the store's safe, you'll have to tell the register you're doing that so it knows a bunch of money is going to materialize out of nowhere. Amusingly, though, Royal had no solution for this. The manual says to just do it even on account, which I think is incredibly funny. I guess they just got to this point, realized they hadn't solved that problem, and said, oh, the hell with it. The manual will know what it means. We're not adding another button. In all seriousness, though, I do wonder this is why the window over the journal can... I've never seen that on a cash register before. They're usually fixed in place, so the journal is completely read only unless you have the key. Here, not only can you flip this up and see, but there seems to be a little platen underneath the bottom view. I think the idea was that you could use a pen to annotate the journal. So if you did do a receive on account order, you could write a little note for later reference. If that was their intent, it's a pretty... But it is weird that they don't mention it anywhere in the note itself. Anyway, the only values left on here are the tools for received account and paid, and an account of the number of no events. And then we have the grand here at the bottom. That's basically everything on here added up together. So everything to tell you how much you're up for the day. This is $77.70. So after all this crap happened, that's how much we made. We're going to go out of business. So that's it for the X report. How does the Z report differ? Well, it doesn't, except that as soon as it's done printing, it zeroes all the counters to prepare for the next day, just like you do on Brady's dial machine back in 1879. That's why you need a special key to access the Z mode. Since it's outright destructive, being able to accidentally run a Z report would open up a lot of avenues for theft. So it's restricted to the higher privileges. This, by the way, is what's meant by the register is considered closed the next morning because we zeroed it out. Any further transactions will get rolled into the next day's totals, making everything very confusing. Now to the X and Z reports, there are others. It can spit out hourly, which tells you how much is sold each of the current day, and you can get a clerk report, which tells you how much each clerk has taken additional reports, no more detail to be had. Certainly can't do anything like reprint the details of an earlier transaction, both because there isn't enough storage to remember them, because it just isn't a great audience for this kind of thing. It's so small that, well, there's two people in one of the farts, everyone's did, right? It's hard to conceal theft. 2 or 3 employee business. It doesn't really need deep forensic capabilities. And if you're really concerned about it, just keep the journals boxes stacked up in the office with 300 little paper spools in each one going back 10 years. At close of business, the boss would roll it up, write the date on it, put it in the box, and one line at a time.
There, this beanie is
This all
done.
sounds really quaint. Hard to picture something this pre-industrial still going on in the 2000s, but hey, the number of times we needed to consult those journals was like twice ever, because who'd be stupid enough to steal from a store the size of my living room? I mean, the answer is that one guy. He did get caught and fired very quickly, so this was clearly good enough.
Yellow, green, white, yellow,
to show you how awkward
white,
the programming
green.
process is. But don't worry, we're not going to spend very long
Is
on
that
it, there really isn't that much you can do.
national flag or something? I don't know.
All is only 75 pages. About half of that is training, like examples of how to bring up different types of sale. Really, there's only about 40 pages of programming info, and most of it's pretty basic. For instance, the machine has some global options like whether tax rates get per hour time, what clerk numbers are even required, because yes, you can run this thing with no authentication at all. But the total number of those settings is 34. That should give an idea of the sophistication on display here. There's really not much to it. As I said earlier, the only setting you'll probably need to define are the tax rates. That's only if you have a sales tax. But unfortunately, it's very complex. So the the state tax table code my eyes bleed. No idea what they're trying to communicate here. Want to, but fortunately, you can just set a fixed tax rate. The machine lets you define 4 tax rates that can be applied to different departments. If you need 5 or more, well, it's very unfortunate. You'll have to get a different machine. So we enter the program. We pick our tax category, press tax 1, punch in the amount we want with digits of decimal precision, and then total, and there you go. That's set. This took me like 4 tries to get right because this machine uses 3 digits of precision. So to enter a tax rate of 9.451%, you enter 9451. Trouble is, the sales tax in Seattle is over 10% and has been for decades. So it's actually impossible now to use this machine in this city. This was extremely funny to me because while I'd already found out the machine wasn't Y2K compliant since it stores the year with only 2 digits, I wasn't prepared for it to not be 2010 compliant. Another setting that the average store owner might need to touch are the departments. By default, none of them have names, and none of them apply tax. So you're probably going to have to set up at least one. And this is by far the most Byzantine process in the whole machine. I mean, look at this. There's a lot here because what you're doing is setting a whole series at once. You start with is the product or fuel sold by the gallon. Can you multiple items at once? Is there a limit on how much that item you can add in a system? Is there a preset price? You gotta need to write all down on a napkin. There's description and press check /.
Why is it mad at you? I don't know. Technology.
A few times you do it here because you're pressing so many keys you lose track where you are in the process. This is where you get to the numbers. Because entering those is kind of. Let me try this again. 0, 0, 0, 0, subtotal 0. Okay, at least we got this one. So it wants a name, right? I mentioned earlier that the department keys are also text entry keys, and they're alphabetical order going bottom to top, left to right, which is so ass backwards from any of the keys. I don't expect.
Well, thank you.
Before you deal with shift, like I said earlier, after T, they restart the letter down here.
You know if this is
my so it took
national colors or team colors.
No.
Technology hates you too.
I pressed back. I had to erase all of my work.
Technology.
Subtotal 0, 9. Where's V? V there. E, A, G, E. I did it. What's the button to save this? It's check valid. It is error. I'm going full office on this thing. Oh,
you did it!
Does it work? Does it work? Beverage! I won! You have to understand, I would have had a lot easier time with this the first go around if I realized that the void acts as backspace. But I hadn't. So every time I hit a wrong key, I know that's on me, but I'm probably not the only person who got confused. I really think that key would have been nice, though now I discovered that if you press backspace, you have to just throw away all your work anyway. I was going to the script that this might seem too tedious, but trust me, it is. I don't think you gotta take my word for that. And I mean, it also just sucks as a computing device, right? The keypad buttons are stiff, they jam easily, the BFD is really hard to read, it's easy to get replaced going back and forth with the manual, and we haven't even gotten to numbers yet. Numbers are great. Suppose you want to make an apartment name back to school with a number in it, okay? You can do that, but here's how it works. Program 00001, subtotal 0. Department H. Okay, so we put in BACK. I came in for a K. K. Alright. Now, how do we enter a 2? Well, we just press 2 on the keypad. Nothing happens. Like it showed up here, but it's not there. Because erase that.
And then another
2 on that. And now the 2 appears up there. Why? Because numbers entered down here aren't shorted as character codes from this violent enormous ASCII code. 30 through
kind of tired.
digits, and then 40 through 92
Pass out.
and non-English characters. And the numbering between 40, which turns out to be the capital letters being entered here. This is a very weird way. Oh, also, if you want a space, you have to enter 2. There is one neat feature, which is why 0 or 1 for a character. Nothing shows up. The next letter, we set that up. G-O-1-R-O-1. Take a look at the seat. Roll with, followed by white characters. This is a pretty janky way of doing things. It's how it happened, and they did actually think ahead to the problems this process would cause. For instance, each receipt has a little banner at the top that says, "Your receipt, thank you." But you can do that with any 5x18 chunk of text you like. Trouble is, that's likely to include spaces and symbols, especially if you want to center line, and no one's in their head. So, Royal included a little worksheet in the manual that you can pre-fill with all the character codes. You can work them all out ahead of time, then punch it all in one go, and have a decent chance of getting it right. So, yeah, I didn't cover every
Okay.
the whole thing, but that's most of it. Besides the department's tax rates and clear IDs, there's really not much else in here. Just a few special features for regional requirements like PAT, and the ability to limit coupon quantities and block discounts fixed rate. So while the setup can be a little tedious, it still limits the scope that at worst you couldn't burn more than an afternoon on it, and then you'll probably never need to touch it again. This machine really has like 9
Made a bunch
features,
of
which
other
is what made
beanies.
it a perfect basics, and that's what we just did. Congratulations! You now know how to run a register. Any register that NCR
And
stopped
blue.
patent in the late 20th century, and which I expect everyone picked up where they left off, but also
Nice and warm.
because a lot of ideas are just obvious. Again, this is talking
This beanie
on the side.
has
Alien, and you've never seen money. The task of developing a cash register.
what's it called?
They'd probably arrive at most of the same
Reflective
ideas.
thread.
So, an hour and a half.
So you can be night.
Because it is
And the rest of it,
even
I think, looks like. Can't remember which.
Walmart and
It just makes me feel like
this way.
eating.
So, for
Yeah.
instance, if you make something up by mistake on a Toshiba short pause or Oracle Micro system, and then you void it, it doesn't get deleted off the receipt. It's just followed by a second negative entry. So it's there on the journal.
This is my summer beanies. Air moved through it.
Managers still run Z reports at the end of the day,
And it's
still check
floppy.
the total amount of voids
So
or no sales.
when my hair gets really big and puffy,
change, things
shove it in
the
there.
difference between
It
this and
goes in the puffy part.
everything else I'll show you in this series is after those basic functions.
There's
That's
this
why
one.
So
This one's very reflective. I use that reflective yarn a lot. This one I call my
also
winter beanie.
what does he report is just what that system puts on. And so
Very warm.
now fully understand
Very fuzzy.
born in a century and a half of paranoia across the industry and hopefully to unpleasant time. So much for figuring out this. It was a nightmare for after weeks of false starts on the
It's on Etsy to see if people are beanies, and they are. There's lots of beanies on Etsy. Some of them are like 20. Some of them are like 25 bucks.
Right size receipt paper after the
I don't feel like
and of course teach myself every kind of transaction. It's not for track down a 75-pound hunk of rusty metal, pull it back home and clean it up solely to use as a prop
what a
for
discount,
3 minutes. All live. So I'm really glad you chose to watch.
I feel very hot.
And if you enjoyed it, well,
I'm very tired.
I'm glad to hear that.
So I'm gonna take a break, possibly pass out.
So
Bye-bye.
if that interests you, consider subscribing to my channel. And remember to turn on notifications if you want to find out when I upload more. If you really liked it, however, please consider supporting my Patreon like these folks are doing. This is my full-time job and
Bye-bye.
pay for my rent and groceries, but also for the
Stop
wildly
watching.
varying artifacts I have to dredge up.
Why are you still watching?
So I couldn't
Knock
possibly
it
do
off.
this without their support.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Everyone else.
You haven't turned it off yet. You're still watching.
I see a stranger.
Oh my gosh.
Sleepless nights.
Why are you still watching me?
Questionable choices.
You really should. You should